This is the ungraded life, where we react less and interpret more.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Ungraded Life. I'm going to step away from my leadership content for a moment because something caught my eye that I think is worth our attention. About a week ago, Pete Hegseth, the United States Secretary of Defense, check that. I almost forgot. Trump changed that title to Secretary of War. I guess that means we can't say we never imagined a major global conflict coming. I got distracted. What I was about to say is Hegseth offered an elevated and dramatic public prayer for our troops in our country after we blew up another country's leader and started firing missiles into their airspace. Anyway, this feels like another screw the Constitution move, right? Where we traipse past the boundary lines that are intended to separate religion from government. Because when we go to war, we need to bring God into it. God's a proven winner after all. So for good measure, let's also have Israel on our side, just in case. There's this strong sense in this country that God's been a big fan of theirs for a very long time. And while it sounds like I'm making a political statement, I'm actually drawn to this situation by what usually draws me into cultural observations. And that's how this moment has already played out in literature. First, let's agree, this is nothing new. Pretty much every culture from antiquity to the present day has had a supreme being along for the ride in their conflicts with other tribes, people groups, clans, countries. God's endorsement of war is as ubiquitous as the flags, banners, and loud instruments humans leverage to make their violence a stirring patriotic pageantry. But Hegseth's prayer is also not new in the sense that Mark Twain essentially wrote it in 1905. Of course, it wasn't published until 1916 because it was considered so controversial. I know. Shocking, right? A brilliant author challenging the overreach or power of a government. Hegseth began his presentation by reading a passage from the book of Psalms. He read Psalm 18:37. I pursued my enemies and overtook them and did not turn back till they were consumed. I beat them fine as dust before the wind. I cast them out like the mire of the streets. Then Hegseth asked God to, and these are quotes, make Iran's land a desolation, break the teeth of the ungodly, and he wanted God to give the American military an unbreakable unity and overwhelming violence against those who deserve no mercy. There's more, but you get the gist. Now, allow me to read a portion of Mark Twain's short story, which is set during the American Civil War, and the scene takes place in a church. The service proceeded. A war chapter from the Old Testament was read. The first prayer was said. It was followed by an organ burst that shook the building, and with one impulse the house rose with glowing eyes and beating hearts and poured out that tremendous invocation. God, the all-terrible, thou who ordainest thunder thy clarion and lightning thy sword. Then came the long prayer. None could remember the like of it for passionate pleading and moving and beautiful language. The burden of its supplication was that an ever merciful and benignant Father of us all would watch over our noble young soldiers and aid, comfort, and encourage them in their patriotic work. Bless them, shield them in his mighty hand, make them strong and confident, invincible in the bloody onset. Help them to crush the foe, grant to them and to their flag and their country imperishable honor and glory. Sound familiar? To be clear, I'm not accusing Hegseth of plagiarism. That would imply he reads literature, which I strongly suspect he doesn't. In fact, I'm fairly convinced that one of the greatest problems we have in the current administration is they don't read much of anything. Recently, Trump declared that his presidential library would be a hotel in Miami. So, a library without books. That actually tracks for this crew. I mean, I'm sure we'll have a sensational ballroom. Now, we can know Hegseth isn't familiar with Twain's work because if he was, he'd realize how myopic he sounded. Case in point, in Twain's story, a prophet enters the church and takes the focus away from the preacher to share with the audience what God heard in that prayer. The prophet clarifies that God received the request, and the prophet issues a warning. He says this, God's servant and yours has heard his prayer. Has he paused and taken thought? Paused and taken thought. I just realized one of my taglines is reflected in this story. And if we're talking about Hegzeth, he definitely hasn't. I'll summarize how the prophet continues. He basically tells the people in the church to keep in mind that if you ask for a blessing upon yourself, you could also be invoking a curse upon your neighbor. For example, he shares with them, you might pray for the blessing of rain upon your crops, but you could also be praying for a curse upon your neighbor's crops, which would be harmed by too much water. And then the prophet turns his attention to the war prayer that was just uttered. And he tells the people, when you asked for victory, you asked for several other unmentioned results which must happen for you to be victorious. I'm going to read it directly from Twain. O Lord our God, help us tear their soldiers to bloody shreds with our shells. Help us to cover their smiling fields with the pale forms of their dead children. Help us to drown the thunder of our guns with the shrieks of their wounded, writhing in pain. Help us to lay waste to their humble homes. Help us to wring the hearts of their unoffending widows with unavailing grief. Help us to turn them out, roofless with their little children, to wander the wastes of their desolated land in rags and hunger and thirst, sports of the sun's flames of summer and the icy winds of winter. Blast their hopes, blight their lives, stain the white snow with the blood of their wounded feet. And we ask it in the spirit of love, of him who is the source of all love, and who is ever faithful, refuge and friend of all, that seek his aid with humble and contrite hearts. Amen. Now, for the catch you might have missed earlier, I mentioned that the setting was the American Civil War. So essentially, this minister and his congregation are asking for all of this to happen to other Americans. In some cases, their own neighbors, family members. This is how I know Hegzeth doesn't read. Because if he did, he'd recognize that he's calling upon a God his Sunday school teachers told him handcrafted all of humanity to be in God's image. All people groups, all nations, every tribe. And he's asking that God to kill, maim, destroy, beat into dust that very same God's own creation made in that God's image. In my opinion, Hegzeth, like so many other people in Trump's inner circle, is just a clown performing for the circus that they operate. And the way that this administration has hijacked Christianity is little more than a mockery of the person that Christians worship. Not only have they not read Twain, they've not read more than portions of the book from which they claim these prayers.
Thanks for spending your time and attention on The Ungraded Life. For more content like this, follow us on Substack, YouTube, and many other social media platforms.